Perfect. Hello, everyone. I'm Farah Warner. I am the Executive Director of the Metcalf Institute at the University of Rhode Island. It's my pleasure to welcome you here today. And I am going to turn it over to Angela Evans to introduce herself. She is our amazing partner in doing this work.
Hi, all. I'm Angela. I am the Director of Communities of Practice at the Solutions Journalism Network. And my work includes all of our climate training and connecting of journalists covering climate. So, very excited to be here with Metcalf and for this conversation around not just extreme weather, but also the responses. Thanks, Farah.
Thank you. And Charles, I'm going to let you take it away. Charles Ellison is on the Metcalf Advisory Council. So Charles, the floor is yours.
Hey, thank you, Farah. Also, thank you, Angela. Really appreciate seeing everyone and really appreciate the opportunity and the honor to be with everyone here today. I'm Charles Ellison. I'm Principal and Chief Strategist of the award-winning public affairs firm BE Strategy, which is based here in Washington, D.C. I'm also a publisher of the bnote.com. So we really appreciate everyone's hour today as we're discussing extreme weather patterns we're experiencing all over the world. How does that affect us? How do we feel? But even more so important than we would sometimes like to admit, how are we discussing it and attempting to explain it to the broader public? So scientists and climate journalists like yourselves are struggling daily with the difficult task of exploring and reporting on these phenomena and the great existential threat they present. Scientists and climate journalists, metaphorically speaking, are soldiers on the climate front line. So today, we're going to have a group of esteemed researchers who are going to offer us insights into that work, like how is Arctic warming creating those extreme weather patterns we're seeing and feeling today? What is a polar vortex? I like to know because I don't. How did that contribute to the epic snowstorm that hammered 2/3 of the US population recently? So allow me to introduce those panelists. We have Dr. Jaime Palter, who is professor of Oceanography at the University of Rhode Island Graduate School of Oceanography. We have Dr. Jennifer Francis, who is senior scientist at the Woodwell Climate Research Center. We also have with us Dr. Kevin Kircher. He is assistant professor of mechanical engineering at Purdue University. It's really great to see you all. So, Dr. Palter, we're going to start with you.
Yeah, thanks so much. And let's see if I can share my screen. And so I only want to take a couple of minutes of today's time to thank you for being here and also make sure to thank the funder who supported this event, which was the National Science Foundation, who supported a research project that I was doing in the Arctic. And with Metcalf, we wanted to partner to get all the way from the kind of somewhat esoteric research I was doing on carbon in the Arctic and think about broader implications. So I'm here just to kick things off with some of the well-known and not so great news before turning it over to Jennifer, who I'm so excited to hear from because she has like kind of the lesser known and lesser understood angles that I think people will really want to hear about. And then to Kevin, who will like make us hopefully feel better about the trajectory of how we respond to the weather challenges that we're facing. So the thing that's really well known is that Arctic sea ice is melting. And you can look at it from a map view and see that like in the early 80s, when satellites were in their first decade of observing sea ice, the whole Arctic had persistent sea ice that lasted all through the summer minimum. So this is in September 1980. And now 2024 is more of a typical summer that we see now, where we've shrunk the sea ice, especially in the summer season, to a fraction of what it once was. And then I love this picture because it really shows you the interface between the open ocean or the naked ocean and the sea ice cover and the difference in brightness. And so every winter, there's less sea ice. So the record minimum for sea ice in the Arctic of all time was in September 2012, and we haven't met that minimum since then for the summertime minimum. But every winter, we've kind of, not quite monotonically, but very close to just decline year after year. And 2025 was the lowest, had some of the lowest sea ice cover over the entire nearly 40-year satellite record. And with less sea ice, we have less reflection of sunlight. It's just that the brightness of the sea ice sends the sun's rays back to space. With less reflected, we have more sunlight absorbed, and the ocean's warmer. The ocean's warm, and likewise the atmosphere. And so the consequence that's very obvious to any observer of the Earth over time is that the Arctic is warming much faster than the global average. And in fact, about 4 times faster if you average over the whole Arctic Circle. And there are regions that have warmed up to 7 times faster than the global average. And so it's hard to imagine a world in which you have this patch of extraordinary warming that doesn't alter weather patterns. And so with this, I wanted to pass things off right away to Jennifer to talk about the role of this change and other changes of global warming on extreme winter weather. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much for that setup for what I'm going to talk about. If I can get this to come up. There we go. All right. So Jaime set me up perfectly here. And I am going to not only talk about the Arctic's role in some of the extreme weather that we've been experiencing, especially focusing on this most recent event, which is a really great case study for how the Arctic is having multiple effects on changes in weather around the Northern Hemisphere, but also stepping back and looking at just the general recipe for extreme winter weather in the Northern Hemisphere. And there are many other factors besides the Arctic. And so, and most of them have a connection back to climate change. So taking a little bigger view here. And as I said, using this most recent event as a perfect case study, this is looking at the temperature differences from normal back on January 28th, when this extremely cold air mass was settled into the eastern half of the United States. But also notice that on either side of that cold air mass, we see large areas where it was much warmer than normal. And I think this is one of the messages that gets lost sometimes in these extreme winter events. Yes, it's cold in Washington, D.C. and New York and places where people are unhappy with that cold. But if you step back and look around, you'll see that the entire West, and probably most of you know this, and some of you who are attending are out there, know that it has been very dry, very warm in much of the West, not much snow in the Rockies up until very recently. So this is the story I want to explain a little more, that how can it be that we've got it so cold in one place and so warm elsewhere? And overall, of course, we know that warming is the dominant trend that we're observing. So it all comes down to the jet stream. And this is something I want everyone to have a much better feel for coming out of this discussion today. Notice I have S here. There is more than one jet stream, just to make things even more complicated. So here's what the jet stream looked like at that time of those temperature anomalies I just showed you. Here's North America in the background here. These red and yellow colors are where the winds are very strong, high up in the atmosphere, about 8 miles up in the air, about where the jets fly, and that's why they're called jet streams. But you can see there's a lot going on here. There's actually 2 jet streams we need to think about. There's what we call the polar jet, which is the one that's more northerly, and it's coming in and then taking this big swoop northward over the west coast. We call that a ridge, and then it dips southward over the east coast, and we call that a trough. And these big waves in the jet stream are really the whole story that I want to talk about today. But there's also this other jet stream. It's called the subtropical jet stream. This tends to bring a lot of moisture and heat into the continent when it's around. It's not always there. But when the 2 jet streams combine, like we see off the East Coast right now, that's one of the main signatures or ingredients that we need to create a big East Coast storm like the one that was mentioned in the introduction. So this setup is perfect for the warm conditions over the West and the cold conditions over the east and the storms. So jet streams generally are created by differences in temperature. So we know it's really cold over the Arctic and it's much warmer down farther south. So this temperature difference is what creates the jet streams. When the temperature difference is large, the jet streams tend to be strong. Jets create our weather, and they also steer those weather systems. So they create those low pressure areas that you see on a weather map and the high pressure areas. And it not only creates them, but it moves them along. And we also see two jet streams happening only in the winter typically. So in the summer, there's usually only one. In the winter, we often have this double jet setup. And there are many factors that affect the jet strength, its position, meaning how far north and south it is, and also how wavy it is. And all of these affect those low and high pressure areas that create the weather we feel on the surface. So these waves, as I mentioned, are absolutely key to talk about. So as I mentioned first, here's a schematic of the polar jet stream. It separates the frigid Arctic air to the north from the much warmer air to the south. When this temperature difference is large, we tend to see the jet stream have smaller waves in it, not like the one you're seeing here, but smaller ripples. And the size of these waves matters a lot. When we have these big waves like this over wherever it is, they tend to stay in place for a long time. And so the weather they create tends to be very persistent. And where you are relative to these ridges and troughs in the jet stream determines what kind of weather you're going to have in your area. So this part of the wave where the winds are coming from the northwest tends to be where it's dry and settled. It's where you see high pressure on a weather map. And this part of the jet is where it's bringing in moisture from the tropics. This is where we tend to have the dynamics in the atmosphere that create storms. So where you are relative to these waves matters a lot. It also determines whether you're in the cold air or the warm air. So as I said, small waves tend to travel quickly, which means your weather seems to change frequently. But when you're in a big wavy pattern like this, we tend to see our weather system stay in place for a long time. So let's talk a little bit about which ingredients in this recipe affect the jet. And is human-caused climate change affecting the recipe? Well, of course, yes, they are. So we've got a lot of ways that climate change is having an impact on what the jet stream is doing. So the first one I want to talk about, and this probably should have been in Jaime's domain, but I'll work on it and she can chime in later. As we look at how the ocean surface temperatures are looking right now, this is just last week during this event, we look across the globe and we see a lot of red. That means the ocean is much warmer than it should be. These are in degrees Celsius here. That's a lot of warming for the ocean. It doesn't sound like much, but that's a lot of heat in the ocean. And so we see these big blobs of warm water in many places around the globe, but we also see the La Nina conditions that you've probably heard about, this pool of cold water that extends usually from the coast of South America across to the middle of the Western Pacific, the tropical Pacific. And La Nina, El Nino's the opposite. That's sort of been the main game in town in talking about seasonal weather forecasting, what phase of ENSO it's called, we're in. But more and more, my belief is that these ocean heat waves, which are being fueled by heat trapping gases that we've been putting into the atmosphere, are starting to dominate. And so even though we're in a La Nina now, the conditions of La Nina are really not panning out. And I think it's more because of these ocean heat waves that have been very, very persistent over the last several months. So we've got this one in the north central western Pacific. We've got a lot of hot water sitting off the southwest coast of North America. And of course, the Atlantic is running a huge fever. And why is this important? Well, these marine heat waves act like generators of heat domes. We all hear about heat domes in the summer over the land, but they also create sort of a heat dome in their regions as well. And what they do is they tend to create ridging in the jet stream because they put a lot of heat into the atmosphere. That makes a bubble, kind of a mountain almost that the jet stream has to get around. And what we see is a tendency for the jet stream to bulge northward in a ridge over these heat waves. Then following that, what goes up must come down in a trough, another ridge over this heat wave, dipping down into a trough again, and then another heat wave. And if you remember what the jet stream looked like that I showed you in the beginning for the conditions for the event that we just had, it looked a whole lot like this. So I believe these marine heat waves are having a huge influence on our jet stream position. And because these heat waves are so long-lived, it means that we tend to see the jet stream get into one of these very wavy patterns and stay that way for a long time. And that's why we've had this very persistent heat and drought in the west and very persistent cold in the east. That extra warm water in the ocean does another thing, and that is that it creates a lot more evaporation of moisture into the air. And what we see over time, going back to the 1940s, is we've seen a very steady increase in the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere. This is a huge deal that I think doesn't get enough play in the media because that water vapor in the atmosphere is the fuel that storms feed on. More moisture, more energy, stronger storms. That moisture also is available for those storms when they form to dump on us as rain and snow. And so we're seeing a very clear increase in the frequency of heavy precipitation events all around the globe. And that's because of this extra moisture that's in the air. So as Jaime mentioned and described really well, amplified Arctic warming is also a very important consideration here. And this is just another take on what she's already showed you. This is the temperature anomaly, the air temperature differences from normal during December of 2025. And you can see here we've got Greenland and Russia and Alaska, how very warm the Arctic has been during that month, with a lot of cold air shoved southward over Alaska, North America, and Russia. And as she mentioned, the Arctic has been warming much, much faster than the globe as a whole. Since about the mid-1990s, we've seen a 2 to 3 to 4 times more rapid pace of warming in the Arctic than the globe as a whole. Now think back to what I said about the jet stream and what affects the jet stream. It's that difference in the temperature between the Arctic and areas farther south. If we're warming the Arctic much faster than the globe as a whole, it means that north-south temperature difference is getting smaller. And that means that the winds driven by that temperature difference are weakening. And we know that when the polar jet has weaker west to east winds, it tends to get into these wavy patterns more often. You can think about a river flowing down a mountainside. When that mountainside is very steep, the river tends to flow very fast and straight, but when it gets out to the coastal plain where there's little force driving it, it tends to meander back and forth. It's more easily deflected from its path. And the same kind of thing happens with the polar jet stream. So now I want to get into another factor in this recipe, or another ingredient, and that is something you've heard about a lot in the last decade or so. And this is the stratospheric polar vortex. And stratospheric is in there on purpose because the term polar vortex has been misused a lot. When I talk about the polar vortex, and I think when everybody talks about the polar vortex, it should be the one that's in the stratosphere and separate that from the jet stream. So sometimes those two things get mixed up. So here we are. I'm going to tell you exactly what the stratospheric polar jet stream is, so you'll never be confused. You can tell all your friends about it. So we've been talking about the jet stream. This is a schematic that is, way, it should be wavier than this, but the polar jet stream is there all year long. It's much lower in the atmosphere. As I said, it's about 5 to 9 miles above the surface where jets fly. But farther north is this other swirl of very cold air surrounded by westerly winds. This is the stratospheric polar vortex. It's much higher in the atmosphere. It's only there in the winter. Big difference between that and the jet stream. Most of the time, the polar vortex sits up there, swirls around, keeps all that cold air to itself, and doesn't really affect our weather very much. When it's very strong like this in the winter, we tend to have milder winters across the mid-latitude continents. But every once in a while, the polar vortex becomes disrupted. And there's a number of ways that can manifest itself. What happens is it breaks down. It can either weaken or it can even split into separate swirls like we're showing in this diagram here. When that happens, those swirls tend to migrate southward, and they tend to emphasize that dips in the jet stream that are already there and make them more intense, make them larger, make them more persistent. And it makes the jet stream wavier, like is depicted here. So we've got an example of a very strong, excuse me, polar vortex in this real data example here, this animation. Excuse me, quick sip of tea.
Take your time, Jennifer. We understand.
I know it's a good place to get a frog in my throat because this animation is so mesmerizing. I know.
Right. It is. Yes, very, very compelling.
Yeah, so underneath this, you can sort of make out the North America here on the left side. So what you're seeing here is the polar jet going from, the stratospheric polar vortex going from its very strong state and then stretching and then splitting. So this is a real world example of a disruption in the polar vortex. This is quite a major one. And you can see how it brings one of those circulations down over North America. And in this case, it would have caused an extra cold blast of air. So there's other ways it can be disrupted. It can actually disappear completely sometimes in the winter. We call this a sudden stratospheric warming, when all of a sudden, this is depicting the temperature differences from normal in the stratosphere. You can see that it's much, much warmer than normal. All that cold air got shoved farther south. And these happen about once every couple of years. And when they do happen, we tend to see a lot of very extreme winter weather. The other one that has become much more, I'd say, recognized as a creator of extreme weather is when the polar vortex doesn't really weaken much, but it gets stretched from its round circular state that I showed you in the schematic to a more elongated state, more like a bean. And so how this happens, and we think this has a connection back to climate change, is when we have all that warming over the Arctic that Jaime talked about, that I talked about, this spot in particular here, just north of Western Russia, is called the Barents-Kara Sea. And it's, as Jaime mentioned, it's been warming there sometimes 7 times faster than the globe as a whole. So what happens is, as I mentioned, when we have one of these very warm places, it tends to bulge the jet stream northward. This is happening, that warming is of course happening because of the heat trapping gases in the atmosphere. So this is the connection back to climate change. What goes up must come down, as I said before. So we've got this ridge that's enhanced by that warming in that part of the Arctic. It dips down over central Eurasia, bringing a lot of cold air with it. It tends to cause extra snowfall. We've got a timeline on the bottom here. We're talking about October here, when this area is at its warmest. Brings that cold air down into Central Asia, increases the amount of snow in the fall over northern Eurasia, and that in turn accentuates the cold. There's sort of a positive feedback happens there with the snow. This very wavy pattern creates waviness in the atmosphere that can get transferred upward towards the polar vortex. Now, if conditions are right, that upward wave energy gets reflected by the polar vortex. This has happened several times already this winter. So that wave energy that starts over in Western Russia here, you can see the map here has shifted. We're now later in December. That wave energy gets reflected back down over North America. That tends to make the stratospheric polar vortex stretch in this elongated shape, and that brings a lot of cold air down over North America. And that leads to the kind of pattern that we saw last week and the week before and the week before, that allowed all that cold air to penetrate way far south, all the way down to Mexico and Florida, and left the Arctic very warm. So this stretch polar vortex is gaining a lot of recognition now as a major factor in contributing to these air outbreaks. So just to wrap up here, I thought I'd fast forward to today because it looks a lot different today than it has. And as you know, it's now stormy and snowing like crazy out in the west, and we're seeing a warm up in the east. And you look at the jet stream because that's, as I said, that is what, that's the name of the game, is what the jet stream is doing. You can see it's very, very different now from what it was during the cold air outbreak. We now have the big trough, the big dip in the polar jet stream over the west. That's bringing the cold air down from Alaska down into the western states. And it's bringing this warm flood of tropical air into the east. And so we can see how the differences in temperature across North America have shifted so much since a couple of weeks ago, where it's now much colder than normal in the west and much warmer than normal in the east. And just finally take a quick look at what the stratospheric polar vortex is looking like right now. You can see it's also retreated away from the North America. You can see these tight lines here showing where the winds of the stratospheric polar vortex are now back where they belong, up over the Arctic. And as a result, we have a big shift in our weather. So I know that's a lot. There's many ingredients that go into a cold air outbreak like the one we had. But as I said, it was a great case example to illustrate a lot of the factors that I think are playing a role here.
Thank you, Jennifer. Really appreciate that. I learned quite a bit myself. And we're going to take it to Kevin, Dr. Kevin Kircher. So Kevin's going to make a presentation. Also, just letting everyone know, I just told you in the chat, after Kevin makes his presentation, then we're going to open up the floor for questions from you all. So you can leave those in the chat. And Kevin, take it away.
Great, thanks, Charles. And thanks everyone for coming. It's a real pleasure to be here. Before I dig in, just a quick little bit of background on me. I'm an assistant professor at Purdue University. My home department is mechanical engineering. I also work in electrical engineering. I have a courtesy appointment there. My research group works on kind of two broad topics. One is kind of big picture energy system modeling, and the other one is basically developing technologies for climate mitigation and adaptation. We work on software and hardware. We have a couple of test houses, and often the stuff that we do kind of lives at the interface of buildings and the power grid. And really this, that's pretty much where I'll be talking about today, is kind of at that intersection of the grid and buildings. So I thought Jen's presentation was fascinating and set up nicely kind of what I'll talk about here, which is sort of the impacts that extreme winter weather can have on us, and then the strategies that we have kind of at our disposal to mitigate those impacts. So I think a lot of us, it's been in the news, we're all aware that Winter Storm Fern, this was the extreme winter storm that we saw cover much of the eastern US over the last several weeks, had deadly consequences, and many of those consequences were related to people losing electricity, losing power during periods of extreme cold temperatures. It's certainly not the first time that that's happened in recent history. About 5 years ago, almost to the day, Winter Storm Uri was above Texas and much of the Southeast, and had even more extreme consequences on the power grid. So where hundreds of thousands of people lost power in the Southeast during Fern just recently, I think it was closer to 1 million people in Texas, with much more severe consequences, more loss of life, and so on. So I don't want to belabor the point, but I think there are several ways that extreme cold combined with power outages can hurt people. And the most obvious one is hypothermia. And a lot of the deaths in both Uri and Fern were that, people being essentially trapped by snowfall in houses that didn't have power. And even if you have a fossil fueled, a natural gas or propane heating system, the controls, the ignition switches, things like that, and those heating systems still require electricity to function. So if we don't have backup power, either from a generator or a battery, or maybe an electric vehicle, which I'll talk about toward the end here, then we're at risk. Some other losses of life, unfortunately, came from people trying to heat their homes with their ovens, which is a source of heat, but also is a source of carbon monoxide, which can be deadly to breathe. And then there were also house fires, people burning furniture and things like that as a way to stay warm, and then flames getting out of control. So serious human consequences. So I'll talk about both of these winter storms briefly, kind of their causes and a little bit of the consequences. Winter Storm Uri, there's a nice paper that kind of came out a few months after the aftermath there by many folks who are in Texas and elsewhere that work on energy and buildings and so on. And they kind of did a postmortem to understand what were the causes, the main sort of causes of the power outages that covered much of Texas in that period. And one was just that demand for electricity was extremely high, higher, it's record-setting peak demand in Texas. And on the power grid, we have to continuously balance electricity supply with electricity demand. And so when demand goes through the roof, we need all available supply to come online to help meet it. And unfortunately, due to natural gas infrastructure, both the kind of extraction infrastructure, but also transmission and the power plants themselves, there was a lot of failure both of natural gas supply and of power plants. So in the top right here, I'm showing the different sources of electricity generation in Texas, what the power grid operator planned on getting from them, sort of in the worst case scenario. They do scenario planning with kind of many different options of what might happen in different contingencies. And then what actually was delivered sort of at peak when the power outages began. And so you can see that natural gas generators were down significantly. Coal was also down. Wind slightly overperformed kind of the pessimistic forecast, and solar did as well. So Uri was really fundamentally about a mismatch between supply and demand. We just couldn't produce enough electricity to keep up with how much people were using. And the electricity demand really came primarily from electric space heating. So 60% of the space heat in Texas is from electric heating, and almost all of that is electric resistance heating, which is very inefficient, as opposed to electric heat pumps, which are a much more efficient way to heat with electricity. So Fern is really a different story. It wasn't about supply not being able to keep up with demand. It was really about ice buildup on electricity distribution infrastructure. So here I'm showing, these are recent photos, I think, from Fern. This is a power line that you can see is completely covered in ice. And all that ice buildup leads to adding a lot of weight to the power lines. And so the power lines can start to sag. Eventually, they can even snap. They also put much more loading on the poles that hold up the power lines. So here you can hopefully see this is the bottom of a wooden distribution pole. This is the top, and those two are supposed to be connected by a vertical pole, which is laying down here because the combination of ice buildup on the lines and ice buildup on a nearby tree, right, caused the tree to buckle and fall over also during high winds. So there are kind of two basic problems here with reliability on the power grid, and they lead to kind of two sets of possible solutions. And I'll talk about those sequentially here. So on the supply and demand side, there's, I think, really one very good demand side measure is reducing the electricity demand from electric heating. And that can happen in many ways. I talked about the fact that in Texas, a lot of electricity demand came from resistance heating, very inefficient electric heating. More efficient electric heat pumps, which are basically air conditioners that can run in reverse, roughly cut in half the energy usage, the electricity usage for space heating. So in Texas, I think they had somewhere around 20 gigawatts of kind of demand during the peak time in Winter Storm Uri that was from electric resistance space heating. So if you can cut that in half, you go from 20 down to about 10. And that was roughly the magnitude of the shortfall of electricity supply during Uri. So that intervention alone might have been enough to avoid some of the power outages. We can also insulate and air seal our buildings, and there are other ways to reduce demand here as well. Another option is just to winterize natural gas production, transmission, power generation. So when there are severe storms in Minnesota, the gas supply network doesn't go down in the way that it did in Texas during Uri, because most of that infrastructure is put inside and it has heating around it to basically prevent buildup of snow and ice and so forth. So this has been proposed, and probably not required, but at least advocated for in Texas. Not just after the 2021 Winter Storm Uri, but also in 2011. There was a severe winter storm that led to blackouts in 2003, in 1989. So this is something that has happened periodically, almost kind of once a decade in Texas. And so far, we haven't been able to kind of get around the weatherization issues there. Although I will say that during Fern, just this year, the gas supply performed better in Texas. So that's kind of on the supply and demand matching side. What about on the electricity distribution side? So one obvious thing that we could do, and this is being done in some areas, is to take all those overhead power lines and to put them underground. Now, there are about 5 million miles in the United States of overhead power lines. And if you look at utility costs for undergrounding those lines, it typically is around $2 to $4 million per mile. So if you wanted to bury all of our overhead power lines, it would cost somewhere between 10 and 20 trillion dollars. And the entirety of US GDP in 2024 was about $30 trillion. So this is on par with kind of US GDP. So it's an option, but it's an expensive option. And by the way, this is being done. Some utilities in Northern California, for example, Pacific Gas and Electric is one example, are burying their overhead power lines at extreme cost, but to basically avoid wildfire risks, where you can have foliage and stuff get in contact with power lines that are overhead and then have sparks that cause wildfires. Another option here, I showed that the line sagging is one problem, the poles breaking is another problem. So one way to kind of make those poles more robust is to replace wood with steel. And that typically costs somewhere around $5,000 to $10,000 per pole, including the labor, bringing crews over and also the materials. And there are about 150 million wooden poles in the United States for power distribution. So again, we get kind of into the $1 trillion of the cost of doing that. So it's not something we can do probably everywhere, but in some places it may make sense. And then another technique is called in the business enhanced vegetation management. And this basically is tree trimming. And utilities already do this today. They basically clear about a 4-foot path on either side of a power line. But 4 feet is not that long. Trees, of course, grow back after they are trimmed. And so you get into risks of branches or trunks falling on lines. So enhanced basically just means doing that, but in a wider swath. So 12 feet on either side rather than 4. And that typically costs on the order of $250,000 per mile. So again, if you look at the 5 million miles of lines, you can quickly count into the trillions of dollars. So we have strategies for improving reliability during winter storms, both the supply-demand matching and also the distribution hardening. But they're expensive and they're probably not going to be viable everywhere. And that means that we're probably never going to hit 100% reliability. So I'd like to talk as well about how we can improve resilience to power outages. If we accept that sometimes they're going to happen and they may happen during extreme winter weather, what can we do about that? And some of the solutions here actually are kind of reliability solutions as well. So the top point is to reduce electricity demand for space heating. And we can do that in part with more efficient equipment, so heat pumps rather than electric resistance heat. So things like electric furnaces, electric baseboards, and so on. If we can replace those by heat pumps, that helps on the mitigation side. But also just insulation and air sealing can passively reduce heat demand in buildings quite significantly. And they can make it such that if you do lose power, you lose heat, you can drift without power for a much longer time before getting really, really, and potentially dangerously cold inside. So that's one approach, kind of passive resilience technology. Another approach is more active, which means having basically backup power in the house or community center, something like that. And that could be from a generator, a backup generator, diesel, or maybe natural gas, or it could be from a battery. And if you have a battery and solar on site, assuming the panels can get clear, they're not covered in snow, then you can have sort of a replenishing source of backup power that could help ride through for long periods of time. Something my research group works on is hardware and software kind of within buildings to maximize the duration that we can get by on backup power during power outages, whether that be the amount of fuel that you have for a diesel generator or the amount of energy that's in a battery. So you can think of this as kind of going into life support mode. Like you might see in Star Trek, when the Enterprise is under threat, they might power down non-essential systems. And so you can think of something like that in a house as well. And then not everyone is going to be able to afford to have a really tight, well-insulated building envelope. Not everyone is going to be able to afford a backup generator or battery, solar array. So I think it's important to have areas where people can go who don't have access or the money up front for those technologies. And that could be community warming or cooling centers during heat waves. Things like libraries, churches, mosques, other areas in the community that have good insulation and backup power and can also welcome in people in need from the community. Another thing that my research group's on, which I think my research group works on, which I think has a lot of potential, is using the batteries in electric vehicles to actually power critical loads in buildings during extreme weather. So here I'm showing basically what we call vehicle to home, or V2H. And the idea here is that you can extract some power from the battery to run critical loads within the home. Now, this does take special wiring and controls to set up. It's possible today, but only a handful of electric vehicle models do this today, and it usually requires electrical work within the home, which can cost on the order of $5,000 to $10,000, similar to kind of the rewiring work that's needed to get critical loads onto a backup panel for a backup generator. But I think the potential here is fantastic. So here I'm plotting on the vertical axis how much energy can be stored in a battery. And so this is a Tesla Powerwall, and this is a GM Silverado. And you can see that there's about a factor of 15 difference between the battery in the Silverado, a huge truck, and the battery that you might get from one Powerwall. And this line here is for one of our test houses about, on a really cold day, about how much electricity is needed to keep the house warm. So you can see that Silverado has at least a couple of days worth of backup energy there. I have some more detailed plots and stuff like that, but I think in the interest of time, I'd like to leave some room for Q&A, so I will stop there. Thank you.
Kevin, thanks so much. Really appreciate that. So Jaime, Jennifer, Kevin, fascinating presentations, by the way. So I learned a lot. So I don't profess to be an expert in any of this. However, I do follow it very closely as both something of a public affairs climate strategist, just helping get the word out, especially to state and local policymakers, and sort of a low-key climate journalist in some respects, getting the information out there. I'm going to open up the floor. We want to allow enough time to open up the floor to questions. Are there any questions from our audience? You can put those in the chat, or you know what, you can just raise your hand and you can ask it yourself. We have questions. Can we put another 2 or 3 seconds for those questions? I know I have a few. So you can jump in, either one of you, Jennifer, Jaime, Kevin. So I'm going to ask this from the layman's point of view, or layperson's point of view. So how did you explain this all, just your thoughts, and sort of that simplified, almost kind of schoolhouse rock kind of way to general audiences, all that you said. And I was taking copious notes on this, and so I just aged myself, so don't mind that. We're living in a time of climate crisis, but simultaneously and also inconveniently, we're living in a time of low science literacy. So we had this major snowstorm, but when people hear phrases such as global warming, they don't think it exists when there are record sub-zero temperatures and a few inches of ice over a foot of snow outside. So do we need to change the language? I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Either one of you can jump in.
Well, I can start out. I think the Arctic is a great hook to explain to people how rapidly and dramatically the climate has changed within a human lifetime, because it's so easy, as Jaime showed, to show just how much the sea ice has changed. And the trick, I think, then is to take that information that demonstrates just how fast the climate has changed in such an important place in the world, how that relates to them where they live. And that's really where it comes. You have to simplify this story that I just told about how it affects the jet stream, of course, because that is
Right.
what is affecting the weather. So it's really not that hard, I think, to talk about that loss of ice, the warming in the Arctic, the basic idea that the jet stream is there because of this big temperature difference, and that when that temperature difference is smaller, it creates these bigger waves in the jet stream that mean that our weather regimes are becoming much more persistent. And it's all sorts of regimes. It's whether it's stormy where you are or dry, which can lead to drought eventually, hot, combined with that, which affects wildfires. I mean, once you've got that basic concept down, then you can start talking about all these different kinds of extreme weather that people are experiencing in their particular location. And I think it's always good to bring it to a local place, whether it's the fire or the ice storm or whatever it is. It's all connected back.
Right. Got it. So, and Jennifer, you talked about, the disruptiveness, right? The heavy impact of big storms like what we had experienced recently. And then, also the disruptive nature, the disastrous nature of like major rain. That doesn't mean they're going to be more frequent, right? Because we've got these massive extended droughts. So we might have a big, massive snowstorm that happened this season, but that's it. That's all we're going to see. We're not going to see, it's still going to be a dry winter, right? It's still going to be, sort of anticipated as a dry winter, or that's what's expected.
Yeah, and like I showed in the very beginning, what one place is experiencing is usually dramatically different from what's happening right next door in the other half of your region. So you get these completely different flavors of extremes that are totally connected to each other, but are exactly opposite conditions. And that is explained by the fact that these waves get basically stuck in place and those conditions become very persistent. And I think persistence is really the key here, because almost any kind of weather, if it lasts a long time, is going to eventually lead to some sort of extreme.
Okay, Jennifer, we have another question for you from Ethan Brown. So, and Ethan, thanks for that. How confident are you and your colleagues that human climate change is causing or worsening the jet stream and polar vortex destruction or disruption scenarios as opposed to ENSO or other natural variability? Marine heat waves seem more straightforward than some of the others.
Yeah, so as the question says, ENSO is a natural fluctuation in the climate system. And that has been around forever. And we know that it does have a big impact on especially North American weather. But all these other things are changing. So the ocean heat waves are changing. The Arctic is warming really fast, more moisture in the atmosphere. So all of these other things that I talked about are related to the warming climate. So I think the important thing here is that, yes, ENSO is with us, always has been, definitely has a role. So does natural variability, just the noise in the system. But all these other things that we can point to now, we think there's a good reason to believe that the stratospheric polar vortex is becoming disrupted more often because of that loss of sea ice that Jaime talked about. And so we have a lot of pieces to this puzzle that are affected by climate change on top of the natural variability.
All right, thanks for that. Yeah, and Jaime, talk about that more, like the heating, warming, oceans, like for example, how do you explain it to a person? I've heard this over and over again as I have like family, friends, even myself vacationing to different places. People are going into the water at beaches and they're saying the water feels hot, it feels warm, right? In a way they've never, like I have a brother-in-law from Jamaica, and he goes to visit his family often. And he's like, this is not the water I grew up with as a kid. It's hot. So how are you explaining that to people who are like, this water is hot, it's warm. What's going on here? Like, how are those greenhouse gases warming that water?
Yeah. So whenever I teach students about this, I think one thing that also doesn't get as much play is that global warming really first and foremost, I'm an oceanographer, so I'm biased, but it's ocean warming. So over 90% of like the heat in heat units added to the Earth system is stored in the ocean. So so all of our global warming manifests as a temperature change in the ocean, first and foremost. And that's because you trap heat in the atmosphere. The atmosphere warms, but it's in contact with the ocean, and the ocean warms in turn. So it's the same mechanism, but now held in by the ocean. And the reasons for that are a little bit hard to explain, but so it's true. And Jennifer showed a beautiful plot of ocean sea surface temperature, which just have inexorably risen over time. Pretty much everywhere. There's very few exceptions. And where there are exceptions, we think might be tied to circulation changes connected to global warming as well. So yeah, so that's the basics. It looks like
Yeah, we have another one from Eric Halverson. Another question for Jennifer. Jennifer, where could journalists find the most recent jet stream shapes and data in order to connect local weather patterns to the waves you mentioned?
Yeah, there's some really good websites out there that put out beautiful graphics that I rely on all the time. Some of the stuff I showed today is from a website called Tropical Tidbits. There's a ton of stuff on there, so you have to dig around a little bit to find the jet stream level. But basically, you want to show winds at 250 millibars or hectopascals, which is right up there in the atmosphere. Another really good place is called Climate Reanalyzer. I think it's University of Maine puts that out, and it's a simpler website that also has some beautiful graphics for just for today. Whereas Tropical Tidbits, you can look at plots that are forecast for the future as well. So yeah, those are two good places to start.
Thanks for that. I'm going to jump in and bring Kevin into this discussion as well. While I think we have about 5 more minutes. Maybe we might take another minute or two. Kevin, so when we talk about infrastructure, basically climate adapting infrastructure. So we talk about you mentioned this. We talk about use of solar, EVs. Even you were saying you could use the EVs as backup energy. Even I read about, how people can move into or create more tree canopy neighborhoods. We do just talk about the higher income populations that can afford those luxuries. And so how do we now get honest about people who can't afford those critical items, right? And force researchers like yourself, climate journalists like Angela and others, as well as local and state policymakers to get urgently creative on the response?
That's a fantastic question, and I certainly don't have all the answers. I mean, 1 out of 3 Americans rent, so they have no control over basically the insulation and the heating systems in their homes. And they probably, unless they have a parking garage or something right nearby, they probably don't have a place to plug a vehicle in that would be able to be kind of electrically connected to their home if they wanted to use it to back up stuff. So it's a big problem. I think for the rental population, I think there needs to be pressure on landlords basically to improve sort of building insulation and access to EV charging and things like that. And that probably needs to come through government regulation. And then I think for low-income populations more broadly, I mean, one of the biggest wealth building innovations that in the 1900s we saw in America was the government-backed low-interest long-term mortgage. So I think that, there should be financing options for getting efficient heating equipment, electric vehicle charging, whatever is needed for kind of climate mitigation, resilience, and just to have a better quality of life, more affordable energy and so forth. I think there should be financing options like that are available for all people, and especially for people who don't have the means or the credit to kind of fund those things on their own. Oh, and Charles, you are muted.
Hey, sorry about that. Thanks, Kevin. Another question for you too, Kevin, from Eric again. Eric, thanks for both questions. Kevin, does your research touch on transportation infrastructure adaptation? Real good, Eric. I appreciate that, especially someone who grew up on subways. most of our local conversation in Providence, Rhode Island, is about snow occupying public roads and sidewalks that we are unprepared to rehome.
Yeah, so I'm not kind of electric vehicles and things like that is kind of as close to transportation infrastructure as I get. I'm not really a roads and bridges kind of person, although I will say that I walk and bike commute a lot, and having snow and sidewalks and bike lanes and things like that is a persistent annoyance for me. But it's not really in my wheelhouse. Sorry about that.
Hey, have any of you had any experience having these conversations with state and local policymakers? Because that's something that I frequently do. Like I'll have conversations with them about climate impacts, climate adaptation, and it's hard. It's really difficult because they have trouble understanding this, and it gets even more problematic when you have interests opposed to climate-friendly agendas who have more influence. And that is something that I don't know. I don't see climate journalists covering as much as they could, and any sort of suggestions on how to have those conversations in a more impactful way. Either three of you can jump in.
I don't necessarily have an answer, but to add to that, one reason I thought it would be cool to get the three of us talk, well, really for me to be able to talk to Jennifer, Gavin, is because I feel like there's that cartoon that says, imagine if we made our homes more comfortable and cheaper to heat and climate change was a hoax or something. Like if you give a solution that wins on 3 levels and then connect it to something that people locally, like Jennifer's work, that connects with like the weather pattern that we're seeing right now,
Yeah.
to me, it seems more appealing. And I love having the journalists in the room. I don't know if anyone's willing to pipe up. Is that a way that connects with your audience as well, to like go from a solution that's a triple bank shot to begin with, connected to a local weather phenomenon, and then the climate change can surface or not in that same context? I'm curious if that's an approach for anyone on the call, really.
Yeah, no. Thanks, Jamie. I appreciate that. The reason I said just I emphasize state and local is because that's a whole nother conversation about the feds, right? So, and I can have a whole conversation on maybe that's something Metcalf can consider on just the policymakers, how we have that discussion with the policymakers as well. So it's important because they're the ones making the regulations or making those changes like infrastructure, everything else, fossil fuels, exactly. So it's important. And we had Ethan Brown. That's exactly how I approach it, Jamie. It also tends to be effective with more conservative folks in my experience. Angela saying, yes, multi-solving solutions are great to cover 100%. All right, we're going to end it at that. Really appreciate everyone's time. Once again, Dr. Jaime Palter, having some of the last word, professor of oceanography at the University of Rhode Island Graduate School of Oceanography. Dr. Jennifer Francis, senior scientist at the Woodwell Climate Research Center. Dr. Kevin Kircher, assistant professor of mechanical engineering at Purdue University. Ethan, I want to thank you at the board. I really appreciate that. Farrah Warner at the Metcalf Institute, appreciate you. Also, Angela, thanks so much for your support. Want to thank everyone's support for making this possible and for being here. So until the next time, hopefully we have more of these discussions. I'm Charles Ellison. I've been your moderator for today. You can go for more information on what I'm doing at thebnote.com. I'm hoping to post, I'm told we're expecting to post this whole conversation at thebnote.com so you can get it replayed, and look forward to seeing you at a later time. All right, everyone, be safe out there. Take care.